I have a tremendous affection for parables. I like stories. I like being told stories. I like to tell stories. And so the parables in the gospel, particularly Luke's gospel, have a special significance for me. But I have to admit that this parable that we hear today from Luke's gospel is always a bit confusing to me, exactly what Jesus is trying to say. So I thought about it quite a bit this week, and I'm going to try to kind of make a point, but it's going to take me a little while to get there. But I promise you, I will land this plane, okay? I'll do my best to do so. Being a student of history, I have a great affinity also for the past and what, in a sense, kind of brings us to the present. We didn't just sort of drop out of the sky. There's lots of things that happen to bring us to where we are and who we are today in our world and in our society. And one of the most inspiring things to read in history are those who stand up for injustice in our world. And I think in particular, I was thinking of earlier this week, women who stood up in the 19th and early 20th century and demanded the right to vote. We can't imagine in our society, in our world today, denying women that right to have their voices heard at the ballot box. But for a lot of years in our country, that was not the case. Based on your gender, you could not cast a ballot. And in our day and age, we can kind of imagine that happening, but that really was an injustice that a few kind of stood up for and said, we demand our voices be heard. And it took lots of years, and more people got involved in the cause, men and women, and eventually women were granted the right for their voices to be heard at the ballot box. That was an injustice that was corrected, thankfully. I also thought earlier this week of the civil rights movement in our country in the 1950s and the 1960s, certainly going on a lot longer than that, but finally it came to a point where groups of citizens said, we will not be treated with indignity any longer. That we should not have to sit in certain parts of a restaurant. We should not have to sit in certain parts of public transportation. We should not have to cross to the other side of a street if a certain person comes walking down the street. We shouldn't have to use a different restroom or a different water font than what other people use. It's an injustice. It basically says that we are subhuman and we're not going to stand for that any longer. It was an injustice that needed to be corrected. In a civil and a free society where we believe that all are created equal, it was a few who began kind of the drumbeat that this injustice is happening, and many more people came on board and corrected that injustice. In our own day and age, it's hard to miss in the news what is happening across the globe in Hong Kong. We have groups of people who are standing up and saying, we do not suppress our voices. We want our voices to be heard. And they march and they protest in the street, and even violence now is starting to take form, but it is an injustice that they are standing up for. So that sense of heroism, of standing up for an injustice, I think is really part of who we are as human beings. It's interesting to read the history of that, to kind of see how people were willing to take on that risk and to stand up for that in our world. I say all that because this parable that we have today, I think, really is about standing up for injustice. There are two characters that Jesus presents us with. One is this judge, who Jesus says neither respects God nor any other human being. That's kind of an interesting way to describe someone. I know people in the world like that. I bet all of you know people in the world like that as well. We usually call them jerks, because that's what they are. They have no moral compass. They don't care what other people think of them. They neither respect God nor any other human being. It's all about them. They're going to do what they want, and darn it to anybody else who gets in their way. So that's the one character that is presented to us. The other is this feeble woman called a widow. Now, widows in Jesus' day had basically no rights, no voice. If your husband died and left, and in a sense died before you did, you had no right to inherit property. That could have gone either to your oldest male child, and if you had no children, then it went to your husband's brothers. You had no right to have any sort of property, to inherit anything. There was no sense of a safety net and such. In our day and age, if there is a widow in our world, we have a safety net. Social Security will, in a sense, kind of take care of them to help them get back on their feet and such, and other resources that are available to them. But in Jesus' day, they were nothing. Lots of widows, and including their children, were sometimes thrown out into the streets and reduced to beggars at the city gates. So this widow, who has no voice in society, decides that she wants justice done. And she goes to this judge, who neither fears God nor respects any other human being, and continues to demand that she receive a just judgment from her adversary. And she's persistent about it. She comes back again and again and again. And I would imagine probably most of us, myself included, a couple of times, if we don't get our way, we usually kind of give up. But she was pretty persistent, to the point that this judge finally relented because he was more so worried that she was going to strike him in the face. I think the word that is used in the scripture is translated to give me a black eye. So he was feared for the threat of violence that this woman would put forth. So he granted her, a just decision for her. But it is an example of standing up for an injustice in our world. Much like the women who demanded the right to vote, much like people who demanded equal rights in the civil rights movement, much like what's going on in Hong Kong today, it is the small against the strong. The one who's supposed to have no voice is demanding that their voice be heard. And that is what is happening. So this should be an inspiration